Alan Alda is now called the last man standing from MASH, but that title carries more pain.
Alan Alda is now widely described as the last surviving lead of MASH, a title that carries far more weight than glamour. At 90, he is still speaking, still working in small ways, and still managing a disease that quietly takes away control of the body piece by piece. But his story never started with fame. It started backstage, in a household shaped by a father who was often absent for work and a mother whose untreated mental illness made home unpredictable in ways a child should never have to navigate. So how did that boy, born into vaudeville dressing rooms and burlesque houses, grow into Hawkeye Pierce, one of the most beloved characters in American television history? And why does his life today feel like a closing chapter not just for him, but for the whole world of MASH? Alan Alda was born Alfonso Joseph d'Abruzzo on January 28, 1936, in New York City, the only child of Robert Alda, an Italian-American performer who had already learned firsthand how unstable a life in entertainment could be, and Joan Brown, a former beauty pageant winner of Irish descent. His father's stage name, Alda, was formed by combining the first letters of his own first and last names, a small piece of reinvention that would eventually become his son's identity as well. From his earliest years, young Alfonso, who the family called Alan, grew up surrounded by the strange rhythms of show business. He traveled constantly as his father worked the vaudeville and burlesque circuits, and he was around costumes, grease paint, backstage chatter, and adult conversations that most children never hear. He would later joke about the odd characters who passed through his childhood, but underneath the humor was a simpler truth. His earliest world was chaotic, transient, and often lonely. That instability deepened because his home life was never steady either. His mother struggled with serious, untreated mental illness for years, something rarely discussed openly in the 1940s and 1950s. Alda has described one particular incident from his boyhood, when he was around 6 years old, in which his mother came at his father with a knife. It was the kind of memory that stays lodged in a child's mind permanently. And later, when Alda tried to bring the incident up with his parents as an adult, his mother denied it had happened at all, and his father said nothing. That silence, more than the incident itself, shaped how Alda understood family dysfunction, not as one dramatic moment, but as an ongoing refusal to acknowledge pain. His parents did not divorce until Alda was already an adult, meaning the tension and unpredictability of his childhood stretched across nearly his entire youth. Rather than letting that instability define him, Alda turned it into a kind of training, constantly moving, constantly reading rooms, constantly adjusting to unpredictable adults. He became, without realizing it, an astute observer of human behavior, someone attuned to the way people hide pain behind humor and fear behind charm. That instinct would later become the emotional backbone of the character who made him famous. As if the family strain were not enough, Alda contracted polio at age 7 in 1943. His parents pursued an unconventional and painful treatment method developed by the Australian nurse Elizabeth Kenny, which involved wrapping his limbs in hot woolen blankets and stretching his muscles repeatedly to prevent permanent paralysis. It was agonizing, but worked, and Alda regained mobility. Between his mother's illness, his father's frequent absences, and his own bout with a crippling disease, Alda's childhood gave him an early, unwanted education in resilience, one he would draw on decades later in ways nobody could have predicted. Alda attended Archbishop Stepinac High School in White Plains, New York, and went on to Fordham University, where he initially leaned toward pre-medical studies at his father's urging, since Robert Alda wanted his son to have a more stable profession than acting. But Alda's heart was never in medicine. He gravitated instead toward English and toward the stage, eventually earning a Bachelor of Arts degree in 1956. During his college years, he studied abroad in Europe, where he performed on stage in Rome and appeared on television in Amsterdam alongside his father, early experiences that reinforced his growing commitment to acting rather than any fallback career. After graduating, Alda joined the U.S. Army Reserve, spending time at Fort Benning before serving roughly 6 months in Korea, an irony that would not become fully clear until years later, when he would spend over a decade playing an Army surgeon during that very war. Before Broadway or Hollywood ever noticed him, Alda spent years doing the unglamorous work of building a career from nothing. He worked odd jobs to survive, driving a cab and working other side jobs while chasing acting work in New York. His first major stage credit came in 1959, when he appeared in Only in America, followed shortly after by Purlie Victorious in 1961, a production that also gave him his first film role when it was adapted into the 1963 movie Gone Are the Days. Through the 1960s, Alda built a reputation as a serious, disciplined stage actor, eventually earning recognition strong enough to secure Tony Award nominations across his career, including one for The Apple Tree in 1967. Broadway in that era was packed with serious talent, and simply being noticed there meant Alda was no longer just another actor hoping for a lucky break. Film work followed. In 1968's Paper Lion, Alda played sportswriter George Plimpton, a role that required him to train hard enough to actually throw a football with some competence, an effort that reportedly left his arms sore enough to need ice afterward. The performance earned him a Golden Globe nomination and confirmed that he could carry a film as a lead. By the start of the 1970s, the pieces of Alda's life, discipline from Fordham, hard-earned stage credibility, film experience, and a childhood that had taught him to read people closely, were quietly coming together into something much bigger than anyone around him had anticipated. Then came 1972, the year that changed everything. Alda was cast as Captain Benjamin Franklin Hawkeye Pierce in the television adaptation of MASH, which premiered on September 17, 1972. From the very beginning, Alda understood instinctively that Hawkeye could not simply be a wisecracking army doctor. Even before filming the pilot, he pushed back against material that made war feel too light or too easy, insisting on preserving the blood, grief, and moral exhaustion of a mobile surgical hospital rather than flattening it into pure comedy. That insistence became the emotional foundation of the entire series. MASH was set during the Korean War, but audiences watching in the early 1970s could feel the shadow of Vietnam in every episode. America was divided and weary, and Hawkeye Pierce spoke directly to that mood because he was allowed to be funny and broken in the same breath. Someone fighting to stay human in an environment built to erode humanity. Audiences responded overwhelmingly, and over 11 seasons, MASH became far more than a hit show. It became part of the American cultural vocabulary. Alda was the only actor to appear in every single episode, and his creative footprint on the series only grew over time. He wrote episodes, he directed episodes, and he played a direct role in steering the show away from broad comedy towards something more layered, where trauma, prejudice, exhaustion, and loss could be explored honestly without losing the show's warmth. He won Emmys for acting, writing, and directing on the same series, an achievement almost no one else in television history has matched. Even as MASH consumed his professional life, Alda refused to let it consume his family life. Rather than relocating permanently to Los Angeles, he chose to keep his wife and daughters in New Jersey and commuted across the country almost every weekend for the 11 years the show ran, a grueling and expensive routine that he maintained because presence with his family mattered more to him than convenience. Having grown up with an absent father and an unstable home, Alda seemed determined not to repeat that pattern with his own children. The series finale of MASH aired on February 28, 1983, drawing an audience estimated near 105.9 million viewers, one of the largest television audiences in American broadcast history. At the emotional center of that finale was Hawkeye's breakdown over the memory of a mother smothering her own baby to keep it from crying and giving away their hiding place to enemy soldiers. It was devastating television, and Alda grounded the moment in raw emotional honesty rather than manufactured melodrama, a hallmark of his acting style throughout his career. Many actors who become inseparable from one iconic role spend the rest of their careers trapped inside the audience's memory of that character. Alda had no interest in letting that happen to him, and in fact, he began building a life beyond Hawkeye even before MASH ended. In 1978, while the show was still airing, he starred alongside Ellen Burstyn in Same Time Next Year, playing a man caught in a decades-long extramarital relationship, a role that signaled his appetite for morally complicated material. Then, in 1981, he pushed even further by writing, directing, and starring in the Four Seasons, a film following three middle-class couples navigating midlife upheaval, centered on a character who leaves his wife of many years for a much younger partner. The film was sharper and more emotionally honest than its light premise suggested, exploring betrayal, pride, and the quiet devastation that ripples outward when one person rewrites the rules of a long-shared life. It performed strongly at the box office and proved that Alda was not simply a television star dabbling in film, but someone with genuine authorial control over his own work. Decades later, in 2025, Netflix revived the Four Seasons as a television series, with Alda himself making a brief cameo appearance, a strange and fitting echo of a role he originated more than 40 years earlier. Alda's collaborations with Woody Allen pushed him even further from the warmth associated with Hawkeye. In 1989's Crimes and Misdemeanors, he played Lester, a smug, self-satisfied television producer, a performance that required him to lean fully into arrogance rather than likability. Years later, in 2004, Martin Scorsese cast him as Senator Ralph Owen Brewster in The Aviator, a real historical figure who tried to destroy Howard Hughes through Senate hearings. Alda played Brewster not as a cartoonish villain, but as polished, forceful, and genuinely dangerous, a performance that earned him his first and only Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor. By that point, Alda had been working professionally for nearly 4 decades, which made the nomination feel less like a sudden triumph and more like overdue recognition for a long, disciplined career. That same willingness to defy expectation shaped another major chapter of his later work. In 2004, Alda joined the West Wing as Senator Arnold Vinnick, a moderate Republican presidential candidate, appearing across roughly 2 seasons in a role so well developed that the show's writers seriously debated giving his character the election. The contrast was striking, since Alda had long been publicly known as a liberal and an outspoken advocate for women's rights, yet he portrayed Vinnick with such grounded dignity that audiences responded strongly regardless of politics. The performance earned him a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Supporting Actor in a Drama Series in 2006, his 6th Emmy overall, proof that he was still evolving as an actor well into his 60s and 70s. Alda kept finding new creative chapters rather than settling into nostalgia. Tina Fey brought him onto 30 Rock in 2010 as Milton Green, the secretive biological father of Alec Baldwin's character, giving him room to be strange and funny in a completely different register. Fey would later bring him back for her 2025 Netflix adaptation of The Four Seasons as well. In 2019, Alda appeared in Marriage Story as Bert Spitz, a weary, experienced divorce lawyer, a relatively small role that nonetheless left a strong impression through the sheer weight and precision of his performance, a reminder that decades into his career, he still understood how to make a brief appearance feel essential. What makes this stretch of Alda's life even more remarkable is that acting was only one part of what he was building. Alongside his film and television work, he developed an entirely separate identity as one of the most influential figures in science communication in the country, a shift that grew directly out of hosting the PBS series Scientific American Frontiers from 1993 to 2005. Over 11 seasons and more than 100 episodes, Alda traveled to laboratories across the country and abroad, engaging researchers in unscripted, genuinely curious conversation rather than reading canned questions. He later said the experience was among the most meaningful work he ever did on camera, because it forced scientists to abandon jargon and explain their work the way they might to a curious friend. Those years convinced him that the public was not the obstacle to understanding science, the communication gap was. Most scientists, he came to believe, had simply never been trained to translate their expertise into language ordinary people could feel and follow. That conviction led him to push Stony Brook University to establish the Center for Communicating Science in 2009. What started as a small initiative within the School of Journalism grew quickly, and by 2013 the university renamed it the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science in recognition of his role in shaping it. Alda personally taught workshops there well into his 70s, using an unconventional method built around improvisational theater exercises rather than traditional public speaking training, on the theory that genuine communication depends as much on presence, attentiveness, and trust as it does on information itself. Scientists trained their practice things like mirroring exercises and condensing dense research into short explanations aimed at a single imagined listener. Within roughly its first decade, the center reported having trained close to 10,000 scientists and medical professionals, and by around 2020, related workshops and training efforts connected to Alda's approach reportedly reached close to 15,000 scientists, doctors, and researchers, including professionals from major institutions on the West Coast. In 2016, the National Academy of Sciences recognized Alda's contribution to public understanding of science with its Public Welfare Medal, one of its highest honors. In 2012, Alda also launched the Flame Challenge, inviting scientists worldwide to answer a question that had puzzled him since childhood. What exactly is a flame? With the twist that the entries were judged not by experts, but by 11-year-old students, forcing scientists to communicate in language genuinely accessible to a curious child. While Alda was building this second, quieter legacy, he was also privately confronting a serious personal battle. He first suspected something was wrong when he noticed himself physically acting out his dreams during sleep, a lesser-known early warning sign of Parkinson's disease. Trusting his instincts, he pushed for a brain scan, which confirmed a Parkinson's diagnosis in 2015, when he was around 79 years old. Rather than announcing it immediately, Alda kept the diagnosis private for roughly 3.5 years while building a disciplined routine of boxing-style workouts, tennis, and physical therapy, treating the disease the way he approached most challenges in his life, as a problem to be worked through methodically rather than feared. In July 2018, at age 82, he chose to reveal the diagnosis publicly during an appearance on CBS This Morning, explaining that he wanted to control his own narrative before tabloids or rumors did it for him. He made a point of emphasizing that his life since the diagnosis had remained full, noting that he continued acting, giving talks, working with the Stony Brook Center, and starting a new podcast. He later returned to acting in projects including Ray Donovan, joking that he wanted people to understand any visible tremor as a symptom of illness rather than assume he had been drinking, a small but telling example of how deliberately he managed public perception of his condition. What stands out most in the way Alda has discussed Parkinson's over the years is his consistent framing of the disease as a puzzle to be solved rather than a tragedy to be endured. He has spoken about finding small daily workarounds, adjusting how he walks, stands, and uses his hands, and describing a strange satisfaction in solving those tiny physical problems one at a time. Parkinson's is not the only condition he has openly discussed. Alda also lives with prosopagnosia, commonly known as face blindness, meaning he can look directly at someone he has known for years and fail to recognize them, a particularly cruel condition for someone whose entire career depended on public interaction. He has spoken candidly about failing to recognize colleagues at industry events, relying instead on voice, body language, and context to figure out who he is speaking with, and has managed to discuss even this with humor rather than shame. By 2025, at 89 years old, Alda described managing Parkinson's as having shifted from what once felt like a part-time job into something closer to full-time work, requiring constant attention to medication, exercise, and small physical adjustments. He has acknowledged needing help with simple tasks like opening packages, offering a rare, honest public glimpse into what aging with a progressive illness actually looks like, even for someone with his resources and discipline. Despite all of this, he has continued hosting his podcast, Clear and Vivid, engaging scientists, actors, and thinkers with the same alert curiosity that defined his entire career. Underneath all of it sits one of the steadiest relationships in Hollywood history. Alda has been married to Alan Alda since 1957, a marriage that had reached nearly 70 years by the mid-2020s. Arlene, a former musician who later built her own career as a photographer, has been by his side through decades of career shifts and, more recently, through the daily realities of his illness, helping him with small physical tasks that have become harder over time. For a man whose public identity was built on wit and control, there is something quietly moving in how much of his later life rests on steady, unglamorous support at home. As MASH recedes further into television history, tributes increasingly describe Alda as the last surviving lead of the original ensemble, a framing that adds a different emotional weight to every public appearance and interview he gives now. In 2019, he hosted a reunion on his podcast with surviving cast members, including Loretta Swit, Gary Berghoff, Mike Farrell, and Jamie Farr, a gathering that already carried a sense of a world slowly narrowing. By the mid-2020s, that sense has only deepened. Alda is no longer simply remembered as the actor who once played Hawkeye Pierce. He has become one of the last living connections to an entire era of television, a body of work in science communication that continues to shape how researchers speak to the public, and a rare example of someone who turned a difficult childhood, a life-altering diagnosis, and decades of fame into something consistently thoughtful rather than bitter, still finding, even now, a new way to solve the puzzle in front of him.